All right, so if you were not here on Valentine's Day, we did do a lecture about Japan, so now you are able to get those active listening notes in case you missed today. So we started with an opening question. Do you believe Japan will be with Nazi Germany or against Nazi Germany in World War II? And why do you think they'd be on one side or the other? So take a minute and answer that at the top of your notes page. All right, so now getting into the actual lecture. So we're starting off right at the end of World War I, right in the 1920s. We just finished World War I a couple weeks ago. And Japan is going to start facing a lot of economic challenges. So the world in general, and including Japan, started moving more towards industrialization, which we did briefly talk about. Specifically in Japan, I mean, we talked about a whole unit of industrialization. But Japan's at somewhat of a disadvantage because they did have pretty few natural resources. So Japan is actually a really big country. Most Western maps don't really show it that way, but it is very large. But a lot of the natural resources they needed for industrialization, they just didn't have. Also, if you remember when I talked specifically about the United States, there was this idea of American isolationism, where they were trying to kind of stay out of other countries' affairs and trying to kind of be more self-sustainable, not relying on other countries for trade, because then a major war could seriously disrupt that trade. So there are going to be a lot of international tariffs, meaning it's going to get more expensive to import different goods or different materials into Japan. So Japan really needs to start looking for expansion, basically looking for colonies, so they can keep up with all this industrialization and become a modern country. Remember, we saw China get taken over in the late 1800s and 1900s, and Japan didn't want the same thing to happen to them. Now there's also going to be a lot of social changes. So with industrialization, they're going to move away from their more traditional feudal agriculture system, where it was really like groups of people would kind of rule areas, kind of like states, and it was mostly based on agriculture. And there's really going to be this shift to urban industry. So people are going to be moving to the cities, and that comes with a different exchange of ideas. Also, at this time, Japan is going to adopt universal education, which is somewhat unique, right? A lot of education at the time was still kind of privatized, not everywhere, but this is going to bring education to everyone in Japan. And with that, they are going to get a lot of Western influence. So they're going to get these political ideas that kind of go against a lot of the traditional Japanese political ideas. And they are going to start to question a lot of traditional Japanese beliefs, like why do we do things the way we do? Maybe the West has a better idea of how to handle things. Maybe we should follow the West. And that kind of goes against military leadership. So the military is not going to like the direction that the country is heading. They don't like this idea of questioning traditional beliefs because a lot of military kind of relies on this idea of tradition, right? And so the military is really going to start to have a much bigger influence in Japan because they're kind of pushing back against that idea of change. A big part of this is going to be because of the Great Depression. We did talk about this. Great Depression is going to hit Japan in 1929, and there's a lot of chaos. People don't really know what to do. Their government is failing them in their eyes. And so they're going to look to a strong leadership. They're going to look to the military to hopefully change things. The military is going to be led by a guy named Hideki Tojo, who we did kind of read about briefly in another lesson. And he is going to be kind of leading, but he does keep Emperor Hirohito as sort of a puppet leader. Again, a lot of Japan, even though they are shifting away from tradition, they still held a lot of traditional beliefs, and they held this traditional belief of an emperor being at the head of government. And so Hideki Tojo doesn't want to just take over and say, I'm leading the country because I'm ruling the military. He's going to basically place Hirohito there and say Hirohito's leading, but Tojo is really going to be the one making most of these decisions, right? But the people trust Hirohito. Also, one thing that did kind of separate Japan from a lot of other Asian countries at the time is they were using a lot more modern technology. Think back to the Opium Wars with China. Their ships were very outdated, their military was very outdated, and that is why they lost. And Japan saw that as a threat and began to modernize back then. So it kind of puts Japan ahead of many of these other Asian nations. So one of the big changes is going to be something that is called the Manchurian Incident. It happens in 1931. This is going to be where Japan, again, is kind of looking for natural resources. So they are going to start invading China. They're not really invading the mainland of China. There's a lot of turmoil in China at the time. It's kind of the warlords period, and there is still a lot of influence from the Western nations. So they're really going to attack this part of China called Manchuria, or they're going to rename it Manchukuo. If you do remember back to the beginning of World War I, and when I talked about Russia, there was that Russo-Japanese War. So Japan, again, they had already shown that they were stronger than Russia. They're going to kind of be encroaching on USSR land. And so Manchuria, the reason they take it, it does have a lot of resources. And Japan wanted to reduce their reliance on having to buy products from all these other Western nations or buy natural resources. So again, they're not quite fascist, but we're going back to that idea of the fascist belief of self-sustainability and self-sufficiency when it comes to their economy. And having their own resources is really going to make it a lot easier to compete with these other industrial nations. So again, Japan takes over and they rename the area Manchukuo. But the rest of the world is upset at Japan. They're going to say, you should not be expanding right now. We're kind of getting away from that, but not really. Basically, the world, the West, is condemning Japan for doing the same thing that the West has been doing for a long time, right? And so there was that new League of Nations that we had talked about that's supposed to be able to settle these differences without war. But they're condemning Japan, saying you have to give it back. And Japan's like, well, we're just going to leave the League of Nations. So it's already kind of showing the limits of the League of Nations. The League of Nations does not have a military. They're just a group of people coming together to talk about things. So they didn't have a military that could actually enforce the things that they were saying. And then the next year, Japan is going to refuse to limit the size of their navy, which again is kind of going against things that the League of Nations would have wanted. But again, it's still kind of showing the weakness of the League of Nations. They can't really do anything to stop Japan. Then in the late 30s, going back to that opening question, Japan is going to get into the anti-Comintern pact with Germany. This was this kind of pact to oppose the spread of communism. So communism was not in China yet. We'll get to that later, but it was in the USSR, which obviously is bordering with Japan. And so they're really going to see common ground by their opposition to communism. If you think back to the Italy lesson, that's kind of the base of fascism, was this opposition to communism. And then this is going to lead to the Second Sino-Japanese War. This was a test question, but Sino, again, meaning China or Chinese. So Japan and China are going to get into another war, and this is going to lead to 1937 Nanjing Massacre, sometimes referred to by another name. And that is where we're really going to be starting off World War II. So got to wait a couple more weeks before we can get to that lesson. At the end of class, we did watch a video where there are questions on your note sheet, and then you will have an exit ticket. I just have not made it yet.